welcome to Tom. This is Tom. Tom is somebody who describes himself as a classical liberal now, and he's generally lefty, right? And he did this series of 6 videos. This is the third of these videos, and in the second and third video in particular, he talks about figures. Now, I'm going to give you the very, very abridged version of what's going on here, and I actually haven't seen the remaining 3, and I won't, I don't think. So, basically, in the first video, he introduces the situation. He says he's a UK resident, and that he has had one hotel near his home be populated by these refugee seekers, as if, and that life in his area has become tangibly worse. It's become physically dangerous for people to walk around, thefts have skyrocketed, and so on and so forth. Duh. Anybody with a brain would say duh. Perfect. Now, he has realized that this is terrible, and he has started looking into why it's terrible, and he has completely changed his mind. In his own words, he's gone from being a generally lefty voter, which I don't know how that works with classical liberalism, but whatever, to single issue voter in terms of this migration thing. Now, the second and third video, he instead goes down the path of essentially estimating costs in various ways of this entire operation. Well, the first of the 2, I think in the second video, he actually talks about government neglect, and now he talks about cost. And he came up with a conclusion. And I want to listen to this conclusion. I want you to listen to this conclusion. And then we're going to talk about one of the most obvious misconception as to how politicians work, in my personal opinion, which is dramatically at odds with almost everybody I have ever spoken to, which I suppose is in Mike fashion. So, Tom, take it away.
My opinion, essentially, is that the government has completely lost control of the borders, and not only the borders, but generally lost control of the economy. I think that they know that they've lost control, and I think that digital ID is their way to regain some kind of control. But why should we all pay in our liberty for their failures? They don't do visa overstay checks. They're not doing the kind of reporting that I'm doing here. They're not putting pieces together. They're not taking action. There's so many other things they could do rather than just implementing a digital ID. So effectively, to a large extent, I don't buy it. I don't buy that digital ID is, just for that. If I can do this, why isn't the government? Why isn't the government looking at healthcare costs, education costs, and all of these different areas and putting all of these pieces together to figure out what the actual cost of illegal migrants is in the UK, or even come up with some kind of number of how many illegal migrants are here? It's as if it doesn't exist, but clearly it does, and clearly it's having a massive impact on living standards here in the UK.
Yes, Thomas, you are correct in almost everything you say. And differently from most people, fortunately, you don't go down the usual path of people in government just line their own pockets, and that's it. And that's the bit I want to talk about. But first, let's address what you have said. So, you don't understand why government isn't calculating, isn't doing all of the, to be honest, quite thorough and somewhat dull for anybody listening to it, calculations as to potential costs of this particular issue. Now, with that said, you didn't even launch yourself into costs of any other issue. You've done a bit of a zero-sum game. You've said all of the money that's being spent in this can be spent in various other things, which I suppose it's somewhat reasonable. But what you haven't considered at all, I think, if I recall correctly, is the general cost of government for anything, both autochthones and foreigners. Of course, the foreigners costing is even more unjustifiable from a nationalistic perspective, obviously, which is what you're suggesting, at least in part. But the cost of governments is out of control. As you said, the government is not in control of the economy. And you said they know this. Of course they know this. Everybody should know this. Anybody with eyes to see knows this. Anybody with Google can go and check what the various types of British debt there are, and then just for fun look at all of the other countries and have the same level of a laugh. So, talking specifically about the facts, essentially, or not so much the facts, but the empirical observation. All governments are insolvent because all governments operate with what Thomas Sowell would refer to as the vision of the anointed. In this case, the unconstrained vision. The anointed doesn't matter so much, though it's part of it. I think it's two separate books, if I remember right. It doesn't particularly matter. But basically, he argues that there are two types of people in the world. The people who have the constrained visions, meaning that they see the world as a infinite system of transactions where all transactions are exclusive, meaning if you choose door A, you don't choose door B. Everything is a matter of trade-off, as he puts it. Whereas the people of the unconstrained vision think that nothing matters, only the ideological goal matters. Meaning, saving, in this particular example, saving the refugees and helping them out, it is a moral issue. Therefore, its cost is irrelevant. In your video, you also discussed how there is this trope that people peddle both in government and as well as among people, which is that the NHS isn't sufficiently funded. And based on your research, you have found out not only that it's very, very well funded, but it's much more funded than it ever was before. Absolutely, there's no doubts about that, even adjusted for inflation, as you have done. That's why, because the NHS is a right, health is a right, therefore it doesn't matter how much it costs. Now, this particular vision, the unconstrained vision, has gripped all of the world. There is no government, to my knowledge, that cares about budgets. When I was a little whippersnapper, I remember politicians on television consistently saying, and we will balance the budget. That was like their standard phrase, which is, of course, it was a lie at the time because they also were unconstrained. So it didn't matter to them either. It was just platitudes, which is what politicians do, which is basic levels of demagoguery, right? But now we're at a different stage. Now governments don't feel any degree of need, and neither do the politicians, to ever say we're going to balance the budget or anything. We're not even going to pay the interest on our debt per annum. It's just, it doesn't matter. Right now, the level of negative equity that governments have everywhere is so cataclysmic that I don't even understand how the world actually functions. Like math doesn't work anymore. So you launching yourself into a very long video in which you correctly look into numbers and figures and try to figure out how one could better spend things, etc., etc., etc. Commendable as you like, but you're completely off the mark. Because the problem that is necessary to solve first is the fact that nobody that has any degree of power has any degree of interest in actually stopping the bleeding. Now, the second thing that I want to talk about is the one thing that I wanted to talk about, which is whenever you speak with people, generally speaking, folks, right? And you talk about politics to any degree, almost always at some point somebody, and most people will agree, will say that politicians are politicians with the implicit but specific goal of lining their pockets. And that, as your video itself demonstrates, is categorically untrue, because we live in an era in which money is irrelevant. Of course, large sums of money or even small sums of money buy some degree of influence. But the currency is actually the influence. That's really what matters, in my opinion. And all politicians are politicians for ideological reasons. Some, most sincere, I think, but arguably that is an assumption. Some of them won't be sincere, but sincerity is irrelevant. What I'm trying to say is the politicians, generally speaking, believe that they are a force for good. However, they are just a pawn in a complicated metaphysical system of power. Like, this has been studied or observed in the past by many thinkers of various times, like absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so on and so forth. I would argue that you do not even need the adjective absolute there. Power corrupts, right? But in what sense? Well, suppose that, for example, I enter government with the idea, suppose I were to put you in government, Tom, and I say, you're going to be dictator for a bit, and you are going to be using all of your math and your numbers, etc., to do things. Okay? First of all, what you'll find is that the first thing you need to do is already do what is already the law. so you'll notice a ridiculous level of neglect from that perspective, right? So you'll have to address that. And then you'll notice, goodness gracious, I need to spend loads of money to do this. It's actually really expensive to undo all of the damage. Right? Okay, so you're going to have to open your wallet. And then you're going to have to open your wallet more in order to make sure that the taxes go in the right places and the evaders get slowed down or stopped, that all forms of illegality are reduced. And so you are going to realize that when you expel all of the people that you want to expel, Britain will feel peculiarly empty in a weird way. And so on and so forth. And that will cause all sorts of economic ripple effects that you're not even thinking about at the moment. The thing is, in order for you to achieve any of this noble goal that you have, of ridding your land of this severe problem that it's got, that has been foisted upon you people, you need to spend an incalculable amount of money. Now, you're either gonna behave like all the other politicians and simply do it and indebt the 87th generation that will follow you, okay? Or you will go, okay, we need to find cheaper ways of doing this, which might be a tad unethical. So there's all sorts of issues. In other words, as negative as what I'm saying sounds, because fundamentally it is, there is no meaningful escape I can see until there is a fundamental reform at the ideological fundamental level. I've already said fundamental, but I mean foundational, right? Level of how the West and people such as yourself and myself view government as a concept. Government needs to return to be focused on law and order and nothing else. Now, this proposition is literally impossible. It is the opposite of demagoguery, which means because you would need to cut services left, right, and centre. You would need to remove access to the NHS. The NHS would need to be abolished. The BBC would be abolished, and so on and so on. So many entities would be abolished. There is no scenario in which a democratic machinery, certainly not the one that we know now, which is the representative democracies that we got in the West, this is an impossible system. This would require a violent takeover. And it's obviously undesirable for everybody, as you have many times underlined. Problem is, I suspect we find ourselves in a moment in history in which we have undesirable A on one side and undesirable B on the other side, and I am sure somebody someday is going to force me to pick a lane. I think it's already happening, in fact. Because I quite like being liberal. I don't like to say classical. I mean liberal in the sense that liberty is what drives my decision making and is the source of my willingness to exist. So, fundamentally speaking, by the way, the position that I have just suggested, my position, is in fact one shared by everybody. Even the people who pretend not to be liberal in this sense tend to be liberals with themselves and potentially incredibly authoritarian with others. Right? So there is that. But the liberal is coherent because he says, I expect everybody to have freedom of expression, economic freedom in particular. You talked about taxes a lot in your video, and I think taxes are one of the fundamental reasons why all of this is happening. Which sounds insane to anybody who, like you, thinks, okay, if I move the money from spending it on these problems with migration and I move it to solving the problem of migration and then who knows, something else, etc. But that's not the point. You yourself know how much the NHS costs more. You've done the calculations. Yes, you're arguing that it costs more because of the migration, but that's almost certainly wrong. It costs more because there's a stupid amount of waste everywhere. So far as I know, in modern times, and so far as is, let's say, popular or popularly known, only Milei in Argentina and Musk with Doge have attempted to do anything to actually audit the government. The government doesn't audit itself, right? And Musk's in what do you call it? Initiative. Musk's initiative was quickly stymied and silenced by Trump himself. Now apparently they've declared truce on one another, but for a bit they were quite acrimonious towards one another, with Musk saying that Trump is all talk, and he's right. Because the moment in which Musk told him, yeah, you need to stop spending money to do your to pursue your ideas, Trump said, yeah, whatever. The others aren't doing it, and he's right. There's literally no argument that anybody can make within this world of pragmatist politics that can hold water, which is what you actually spent the entire videos doing. You've told us, various costs and figures and numbers and danger and crime and blah, 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 blah. And you're right, probably on all accounts, and it even doesn't matter if you are around. Because the primary criminal that you've got is your very government. The one that you are now referring to as neglectful, and the one that you're now saying they're promoting this in order to gain control. They are trying to gain control, but not the control you think. They're not trying to get control over the problem that you are arguing exists, which obviously it does. But they are trying to take control of your life, potato. They don't care if Abdallah or whatever his name is, right, who has already been convicted 97 times for some kind of violent crime, keeps going free, right? Because that's painful, man. You need to deal with that guy. But you're lovely. You're lovely because all you do is you just protest mildly. You're civilized. You don't litter. You clean up after yourself. You're a lovely guy. Therefore, you're also lovely to fine or tax, and so on and so forth. They destroy you in order to not so much finance the criminals, though, heck, I don't know. There may be some of that there. But primarily to finance their infinite thirst for infinite power, using infinite money that they infinitely don't have. So, Anybody, to return to my point, I'm sorry, anybody who argues ever that government is about stealing or lining their own pockets and so on and so forth is only true. This statement is only correct insofar as it is directly related to accumulating power and then exercising it. So there. But thank you for your videos, sir. Must have taken you a lot of work to put them together. I am afraid your videos don't read. They watch, I suppose. They are viewed the same way as one would read the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, or something like, for example, the what's it called? The Adam Smith book, the famous one. I can't remember now what it's called. The Wealth of States or something like that. The Wealth of Nations, I think. It's just an endless sea of figures and speculations based on those figures, and it's good. It's good stuff. I mean, it's great. It's just not very gripping, and you're missing the fundamental point. You're pretending that Keir Starmer cares about what you think, which I'm terribly sorry, Tom, but you're wrong. He doesn't, and nobody else does either. That includes the people on the opposite side. They will all act ideologically, spending as much as they need to spend in order to act with that type of ideology, making you poor, destroying your life, destroying your children's life, and so on and so forth. With that said, I will throw you an olive branch, because what you're talking about is absolutely true. Having to live among savages is irritating. That's not what you signed up for. That's not what anybody signed up for. To my knowledge, the only solution to that is migrating away, meaning fleeing, and then instituting some kind of incredibly ugly, ideologically speaking, ugly place. Something like ugly from the perspective, of a liberal. Like, for example, something that says only whites can come in here, and then you protect that area, right? Only white people of good character. Nobody wants to think this. But I have a distinct feeling that everybody's going to start to. So, a good night to you and everybody else.